The morning began like so many others at the cabin, quiet, calm, and untouched by the chaos of the outside world. Mist clung to the glassy surface of the lake, rolling lazily across the water like a living breath from the earth itself. I sat on my porch with an old enamel mug of coffee warming my hands, the steam mixing with the morning fog. The pine trees that ringed the lake swayed gently in the breeze, their needles whispering secrets to each other. It was the kind of peace people chase their entire lives but rarely find, the reward for stepping away from the suburban grind and all its endless rules and regulations. This cabin wasn't just wood, nails, and stone. It was my anchor, a legacy built by my grandfather when the land was still wild. I often thought about the summers I'd spent here as a kid, learning how to fish on the old dock, or chopping wood with my father in the early dawn light. Every creak of the floorboards, every knot in the timber walls, carried memories that no one could take away. At least, that's what I believed before that morning. The knock shattered that peace like a stone through glass. It wasn't a polite tap, it was sharp, insistent, almost hostile. 3 quick raps that carried an authority they didn't actually have. I set my mug down slowly, my gut already tightening, and opened the door. Standing there, framed by the rising sun, was Karen. She looked exactly as you'd imagine her, blonde hair pulled too tight into a ponytail, a pastel sweater tied neatly over her shoulders despite the cool air, and those oversized sunglasses that made her expression unreadable but her attitude painfully obvious. In her hands, clutched like a weapon, was a clipboard stacked with papers. Behind her stood 2 other HOA board members, one of them shifting uncomfortably like he already knew this was a bad idea, the other puffed up with self-importance. Karen cleared her throat dramatically before I could even say good morning. "We've reviewed the situation," she announced, her voice cutting through the morning quiet like a chainsaw. "And this structure doesn't meet HOA standards. You'll need to tear it down." For a moment, I just stared at her, trying to process the absurdity of what I'd just heard. Tear it down. This cabin. My family's cabin that had stood here for decades, long before any HOA was ever dreamed up in a committee meeting? At first, I honestly thought she was joking. A bad joke, sure, but maybe she was here about something else, and this was her way of lightening the mood. But when I laughed, her lips didn't twitch, her face didn't soften. The sunglasses reflected me back at myself, arms crossed on the porch like some outlaw about to be handed a notice of execution. She shoved a folded letter into my hand with the kind of satisfaction only people like Karen feel when they think they've cornered you. The paper was official-looking, stamped with the HOA's logo and filled with language meant to intimidate, notice of violation, non-compliance, immediate action required. I skimmed it, my heart thumping harder with every line. They weren't bluffing. The letter stated that my cabin violated community aesthetic guidelines and structural safety concerns, and that I had 30 days to demolish it myself or face legal consequences. I tried to steady my voice as I looked back up at her. This cabin was here before you. Before the HOA. Before any of these rules. But Karen just raised an eyebrow, lips curling into that smug smile people wear when they think they've already won. "Rules are rules," she said simply, as if that explained everything. Her little entourage nodded behind her, though the man on the left wouldn't meet my eyes. I felt anger rising hot in my chest, but I forced myself to stay calm. Losing my temper was exactly what she wanted, to paint me as some unruly, unreasonable homeowner who couldn't follow community standards. So instead, I folded the letter neatly, set it on the porch railing, and said, "You're going to regret this." Her smile faltered for half a second, just enough to let me know she'd heard the steel in my voice. Without another word, she turned on her heel, the other board members scrambling to follow as she marched down my gravel drive, clipboard clutched tight like a sheriff's badge. When they were gone, I sank back into my chair, staring at the letter but not really seeing it. The lake was still there, the trees still whispered, but the peace of the morning had been poisoned. I thought of my grandfather, swinging a hammer with sweat on his brow as he built this place by hand. I thought of my father teaching me to split firewood in the yard. I thought of all the times this cabin had been a refuge from life's storms, breakups, job losses, the grind of bills and responsibilities. This wasn't just a cabin. It was heritage. It was memory. It was survival. And no HOA, no clipboard-wielding Karen, was going to take it from me. I didn't know exactly how yet, but I knew this. They had picked the wrong man and the wrong cabin to try and tear down. The letter from the HOA didn't collect dust for long. Within a week, my mailbox began to overflow with notices, each one more threatening than the last. They came printed on glossy HOA letterhead, stuffed into official envelopes like they were handing down laws from on high. Every morning I'd walk out to grab the mail, and every morning there it was, another violation, another failure to comply, another sheet of paper that smelled of toner and arrogance. The fine started small at first, $50 here, $100 there, but quickly ballooned into daily penalties that supposedly stacked until I would owe thousands. The irony! I never signed up for their HOA. This cabin had existed long before the subdivision popped up, long before Karen marched around with her clipboard, and long before a group of neighbors decided to play government. Still, they were relentless. It wasn't just paper. Karen herself began showing up at the edge of my property line, standing there like a self-appointed sentry. Sometimes she'd come alone, scribbling furiously on her clipboard while stealing glances at my cabin. Other times she'd bring her little entourage, pointing at my chimney, my deck, even the flower boxes under the windows, as though every nail and board was a crime against the neighborhood. And then the rumors began. It started with hushed whispers among the neighbors, then grew louder until I could hear them carried down the road whenever I walked into town. That cabin's not safe. He's squatting illegally. The structure's going to collapse and hurt someone. It was laughable, considering the place had stood through storms that ripped shingles off half the houses in the subdivision, but the seed had been planted, and Karen watered it daily with her gossip. One afternoon, I caught her talking to a family that had just moved in, gesturing toward my place like she was pointing out a toxic waste dump. "It's only a matter of time before the county condemns it," she said loudly, knowing I could hear her from the porch. I sipped my coffee and locked eyes with her, not saying a word. It was a battle of patience now, and Karen thought she could outlast me. What she didn't realize was that I had weathered storms far harsher than her sharp tongue and cheap paper threats. Things escalated further when the county inspectors showed up, courtesy of Karen's constant complaints. I remember one particular morning when a white pickup truck with the county seal on the side pulled into my gravel drive. A man in a hard hat stepped out, clipboard in his hand. For a split second, I felt a twinge of panic. What if they really did find something? What if Karen's lies finally stuck? But the inspector was professional, polite, even apologetic. He walked through the cabin, checked the beams, the foundation, the roof. He scribbled a few notes and shook his head. "Place is solid," he said. "Frankly, better built than most of those cookie-cutter homes down the road." I almost laughed. Karen had been standing at the edge of the drive, sunglasses on, arms crossed, waiting for him to deliver her victory. When he instead handed me a signed paper declaring the cabin safe and up to code, her jaw tightened like she was biting down on a lemon. Without a word, she spun on her heel and stomped away, gravel crunching under her pristine sneakers. It was a small victory for me, but I knew it wouldn't be the last time she tried. The harassment didn't stop there. Soon, I noticed cars slowing as they passed my property, neighbors who once waved now looking away awkwardly. I even found a note pinned to my cabin door one evening that read, "Do the right thing and tear it down before it's too late." No signature, of course, but the handwriting was neat, controlled, suspiciously like the notes Karen herself often jotted down. The whole thing had turned into a campaign of intimidation, designed to make me feel like I was the problem, like my cabin was an unwanted guest on land my family had owned for generations. But instead of breaking me down, their tactics lit a fire inside me. Every fine, every rumor, every sideways glance only reminded me how much I had to lose, and how determined I was not to give in. By the end of that month, I had stopped looking at their letters with fear and started stacking them like trophies on my desk. To them, each notice was a nail in the coffin of my cabin. To me, it was fuel for the fight I knew was coming. Karen had made her move. Now it was my turn. And if she thought she could intimidate me into swinging the wrecking ball on my own history, she had no idea what kind of battle she'd just started. The turning point came late one evening, when I sat at the old wooden desk inside the cabin with their latest violation letter spread out in front of me. The stack of notices had grown so tall it could barely be held together with a rubber band, each one stamped with the same hollow threats and the same smug insignia of the HOA. For weeks I'd been reactive, reading their demands, tossing them aside, grumbling under my breath about Karen and her clipboard army. But that night, staring at the pile, something shifted inside me. My grandfather used to say, when someone picks a fight with you for no reason, you've got two choices: bow your head, or make damn sure they regret it. I decided then that if they wanted a fight, I was going to give them one. Not by yelling, not by caving, but by outsmarting them. I grabbed a fresh notebook and started writing. Dates of letters. Times of visits. Names of inspectors. I even noted when Karen appeared on the edge of my property, how long she lingered, and what she said loud enough for me to hear. Each line I wrote felt like reclaiming a piece of my power, like building a shield out of their own arrows. The next morning, I drove into town and parked in front of the county records office, a squat brick building that smelled faintly of dust and ink. Inside, I was greeted by rows of filing cabinets, shelves sagging under decades of paperwork, and a clerk who looked more tired than the walls around him. I explained my situation, and though he raised an eyebrow when I mentioned the HOA, he disappeared into the back and returned with a stack of documents thicker than a phone book. Property deeds. Building permits. Historical surveys. I spread them out on the counter and began combing through them, page by page. And there it was, in black and white, my grandfather's original building permit, signed and approved long before the HOA even existed. Alongside it were county maps showing the property line, clearly marked outside of HOA jurisdiction. It was like finding buried treasure, hard proof that my cabin wasn't just legitimate, it was untouchable by their so-called rules. I paid for copies, tucked them under my arm like a weapon, and walked out of that office with a new kind of confidence humming in my chest. But gathering proof wasn't enough. I knew Karen, and I knew she wasn't going to roll over just because the county had my back. She thrived on intimidation, on constant pressure, on making life so unbearable that people gave in simply to make her stop. So I built my case like a fortress. Every letter she sent, I photocopied and filed. Every inspector's visit, I documented with photos and signed statements. I even installed a cheap security camera at the edge of my porch, just in case she decided to step foot where she wasn't welcome. Sure enough, within days the camera caught her pacing near the property line, muttering into her phone, waving her arms as though rallying invisible troops. Each piece of evidence felt like laying a brick in the wall between me and her nonsense. It wasn't about revenge, it was about drawing a line in the sand and daring her to cross it again. What surprised me most during this time wasn't Karen's persistence. I expected that, but how quickly some neighbors began to show cracks in their loyalty to her. One evening, as I was stacking firewood, a man from down the road stopped by. He glanced around nervously before speaking, as though he didn't want anyone to see him talking to me. "Look," he said quietly, "I don't agree with what they're doing. That cabin's been here longer than half of us. My dad used to fish off your dock when he was a kid." He offered to write a statement on my behalf, swearing that the cabin was safe, legal, and part of the community for generations. Over the next week, 2 more neighbors approached me with similar offers, quietly slipping me words of support while keeping their distance from Karen's wrath. It was proof that even though she was loud, she wasn't loved. And that mattered more than she realized. By the end of that month, my case was airtight. A binder full of legal documents, a thumb drive of video evidence, a stack of witness statements, and a growing list of complaints I had filed with the county against the HOA itself. Every ounce of harassment they had thrown my way was now documented, catalogued, and ready to be turned against them. Karen had started this war with paper and intimidation. I was going to finish it with facts and patience. For the first time since that first knock on my door, I felt not just defensive but dangerous. The next time Karen tried to push me, she wouldn't be facing the quiet man on his porch with a coffee mug. She'd be facing someone armed to the teeth with truth, law, and a stubbornness carved from years of cabin living. And I couldn't wait to see the look on her face when she realized the trap she had walked into. The courthouse was nothing fancy, just a squat concrete building on the edge of town, with faded paint on the walls and fluorescent lights that hummed overhead like angry bees. But that morning, it felt like the arena where everything would be decided. I walked through the glass doors with my binder tucked under one arm, thick with documents, photos, and statements I had painstakingly collected. My boots echoed against the tiled floor, and I could feel eyes on me from the benches where HOA members had gathered in a little huddle. At the center of them all sat Karen, her pastel sweater draped perfectly over her shoulders, her visor perched proudly on her head as if she thought it belonged in a courtroom. She didn't look nervous, she looked smug, as if the verdict was already hers and this entire proceeding was just a formality. When our eyes met, she smiled that tight-lipped smile I had come to know too well, the kind that said, "You're finished." I didn't return it. Instead, I walked straight past her, sat down with my lawyer, and opened the binder on the table, letting the thick stack of evidence speak for itself. When the judge entered and the session began, the HOA wasted no time. Their lawyer, a man in a pressed suit and shiny shoes, stood up and launched into a speech about community standards and safety concerns. He painted my cabin as an outlaw structure, a dangerous eyesore that threatened to lower property values for everyone around the lake. Karen nodded along dramatically with every word, even clutching her chest at one point as though my cabin was personally attacking her sense of order. Their lawyer waved a stack of photos, carefully angled shots that made the cabin look crooked, shadowy, menacing. He pointed to the HOA bylaws, reading passages in a booming voice, trying to drown the room in authority. And for a moment, I could see some heads in the room nodding. This was their show, and they had rehearsed it well. But as I sat there, listening, I felt oddly calm. Because I knew what was coming. I knew that beneath their glossy words, their case was built on sand. When it was our turn, my lawyer rose slowly, almost casually, and laid the first document on the judge's bench. "This," he said, tapping the yellowed paper, "is the original building permit for the cabin in question, issued by the county in 1963. Approved. Filed. Legal." He handed over the county maps next, each one clearly showing the property line drawn outside the boundaries of the HOA's authority. Then came the inspection reports, signed by county officials who had personally declared the structure safe and sound. The judge flipped through them, his brow furrowing deeper with each page. My lawyer didn't stop there. He played video footage from my porch camera showing Karen pacing the property line, clipboard in hand, muttering threats into her phone. He held up sworn statements from neighbors, people who had lived there longer than the HOA itself, confirming that the cabin had always been part of the community and was never under HOA rule. Each piece of evidence landed like a hammer strike, and with every one, I could feel Karen's confidence shrinking. Her smile had vanished, her jaw clenched so tight the muscles in her cheek twitched. The judge finally leaned back in his chair, tapping his pen against the armrest. He turned to the HOA's lawyer first, then to Karen, and asked a single question, "On what legal grounds are you pursuing this?" Silence stretched in the room like a taut wire. The lawyer shuffled his papers, trying to find something, anything, that would hold water. Karen shifted in her seat, her face flushing red, but no words came. They had built their case on intimidation, on fear, on the assumption that no one would ever fight back. But in the cold light of facts, it crumbled to dust. The judge shook his head slowly. "This is a waste of the court's time," he said flatly. "The property is legal, the structure is sound, and the HOA has no jurisdiction here. Case dismissed." His gavel cracked against the bench, and the sound echoed like thunder through the room. Karen shot to her feet, sputtering, trying to protest. But the community. The appearance. The judge cut her off with a raised hand. "Enough. I will not hear another word. If you continue this harassment, the homeowner will have grounds to pursue legal action against you." The silence that followed was sweeter than any victory speech I could have imagined. The board members who had followed Karen in with their heads held high now stared at the floor, shuffling their papers, desperate to disappear. My lawyer closed the binder with a snap, and I felt a weight lift off my chest that had been pressing there for months. As I stood to leave, I glanced at Karen one last time. Her visor was crooked now, her face twisted in a mix of fury and humiliation. For once, the clipboard stayed still in her hands. She had strutted in expecting to win. Instead, she had been exposed in front of everyone. And as I walked out of that courthouse into the bright sunlight, I knew one thing for certain: the fight was over, and the cabin still stood. When I stepped out of the courthouse that day, binder still under my arm, the sun seemed brighter than it had in months. The air felt sharper, cleaner, as if I'd been carrying a storm cloud on my shoulders that had finally blown away. I stood for a long moment on the courthouse steps, watching cars pass on the street below, just breathing it in. People filtered out behind me, some whispering to each other, some stealing glances my way. And though I didn't care for the attention, I noticed something different in their eyes. Not pity, not avoidance, but respect. The cabin had become more than just my fight. It had turned into a symbol of standing your ground against a machine that thrived on intimidation. Karen stormed past, red-faced, visor pulled low as if she could hide beneath it, her little entourage trailing awkwardly behind. She didn't look at me. She didn't dare. For the first time, it wasn't me avoiding her gaze, it was her avoiding mine. That alone was worth every sleepless night, every stack of letters, every ounce of stress. The days that followed felt strangely quiet, almost eerily so. My mailbox, once stuffed daily with violation notices, was suddenly empty of HOA letters. The only things that showed up were bills, grocery ads, and the occasional fishing magazine. The silence was disarming at first. I kept half expecting another inspector to show up, another note taped to my door, another whisper at the edge of my property. But the harassment had stopped cold, like someone had flipped a switch. Word of the judge's decision had spread fast, and it seemed Karen had lost not only her case but also her grip on the neighborhood. A few of the board members resigned quietly, citing personal reasons. Others stayed, but their authority felt hollow, their voices softer than before. The same neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid me now stopped at the fence to chat. They asked about fishing conditions, about the cabin's history, about my grandfather. Some even apologized for not standing up sooner, admitting that Karen had intimidated them, too. I didn't hold it against them. Fear is a powerful weapon, and Karen had wielded it for years. But now, that weapon was gone. One evening, as the sun sank low and painted the lake gold, I sat on the porch with a fresh cup of coffee and thought about everything that had happened. The cabin stood unchanged, solid as ever, the wood glowing warm in the fading light. The dock stretched out over the water, steady beneath the lapping waves, just as it had since my childhood. Nothing physical had changed, and yet everything had. For months, this place had felt under siege, as though its walls couldn't keep out the stress, the anger, the constant invasion of peace. But now, it felt like home again. Every creak of the porch boards, every chirp of the crickets, every ripple across the lake reminded me why this fight had been worth it. It wasn't just about wood and nails. It was about memory, about family, about refusing to let bullies rewrite history for their own convenience. And sitting there, I felt something I hadn't felt since the first knock at my door: peace. As for Karen, the community slowly saw her for what she was. Her once commanding presence, strutting down the road with clipboard in hand, was reduced to bitter mutterings behind closed doors. She tried, of course, to salvage her reputation. I heard she held a special meeting of the HOA to declare that the court's decision had been unfair, that the judge was biased, that I had manipulated the system. But fewer and fewer people showed up to listen. By winter, I rarely saw her at all, except through the windshield of her SUV as she sped past, pretending not to notice me chopping wood or repairing the dock. The power she had once wielded with a single phone call, a single letter, was gone. And in its place stood the truth. People didn't fear her anymore. They saw her for what she was, a bully who picked the wrong target. Months later, life had settled back into its old rhythm. I split logs for the stove, fished off the dock, and brewed coffee on quiet mornings without a single worry about who might come knocking. Sometimes, neighbors joined me by the water, kids running barefoot through the pines, laughter carrying across the lake. And every so often, someone would bring up the fight. How close I'd come to losing the cabin, how relentless the HOA had been, how satisfying it was to see justice served. I'd just smile and shrug. Because for me, the real victory wasn't about humiliating Karen or silencing the HOA. It was about sitting on that porch again, listening to the world wake up around me, knowing that the cabin, and everything it stood for, was safe. The HOA had demanded I tear it down. Instead, I built something stronger than ever, a reminder that sometimes, when you fight back, you don't just save a cabin. You save a piece of yourself.